I can feel it. Cognitive dissonance, but this tension's indicative of a world riddled with fractures. Each break drawing lines of division, causing blindness to the prescription of loving God by loving neighbor as self. How? When my body keeps count of every trauma, triggers activate at the idea of breath. I'm a reflection of the world around me. But it is written, I have overcome the world. If Jesus calls us to turn from an inward focus toward him, perhaps such effort can cause us to turn our posture from sin toward hope, from barriers that beget conflict toward bridges that evoke belonging, turning our longing for relation into reality and away from the ways of this fractured world by following the one who has overcome it. Perhaps we can turn this world and the fractures we find into a reflection of heaven that is good, beautiful, and kind.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, that's, no, ma'am, sit down. No. You guys make me feel really good about myself. Hey, welcome. Happy Sunday morning. The sun is out, and I feel like that's really good for my internal soul. And if you're online, thank you for tuning in with us. We're really glad you're in. Check in with us. We'd love to get to know you. And so, yes, today we're going to continue on our series, Good, Beautiful, and Kind. And in the 80s, if you didn't know this, there was a commercial for a really, really crappy cup of coffee. But in the commercial, right, and the 80s are great. If you haven't watched Stranger Things, you can relive them. But in the 80s, there's this commercial, and there's a guy drinking a cup of coffee, and he goes, the way life should be, right? And it was really bad coffee. But I think that there is something about that commercial that speaks to us, and maybe not you, but at a soul level, right? Because we look around the world and we know that things aren't the way they should be, and so we seek things to make them the way they should be. And I'm going to tell you, Maxwell House coffee roasters will not make the world the way that it should be. If you've ever had that. And I'm going to be very honest with you. At work, that's what they drink. They drink like Folgers and Maxwell House. They switch between the two, and it's a real problem. I promise Phil's is not paying me for saying this either, as I have that there. But we look around and we say, hey, the things really are not as they should be, right? I'm discontent. I'm unhappy. I see the brokenness, the pain in this world. And so we've been doing this series called The Good and Beautiful and Kind, and I'm just going to make a quick plug for the book by Rich Viotis. If you have not read that, I'm telling you, it's like one of those top 5, top 10 books that I've ever read. It's phenomenal, and so I'd really, really 10 out of 10 recommend that. And so we're looking at that, and kind of the theme of that is this idea of becoming whole in a fractured world. Because you look around, and I think we all agree that the world is pretty fractured, right? There's violence, there's division, there's racism, there's tension, there's conflict all over the place. And all of us, if we're honest with ourselves, we long for this like good and beautiful and kind life, right? Our soul actually aches for it. And there's a lot of broken relationships that you could probably say to yourself, yeah, I have either experienced that firsthand or I know somebody who has. And there's this thing in our heart that says there's got to be a different way, right? This is not the way that life's supposed to be. And so when we look at the life of Jesus, we actually can look and see that he embodies how to be whole in this broken world and can actually break down the walls. We're going to build some walls here in a second of hostility and bring about that good and beautiful and kind hope, because he is a good and beautiful and kind God, right? And he provides hope to us in those fractured, in those difficult relationships. But as we all know, if you haven't listened to Michael's message from 2 weeks ago, sin is a problem. And I'm telling you, I don't know if I've heard it put better than she did a couple weeks ago. And there's this idea of this, like a bug in the system. I'm not a computer guy, but you know, if there's like a bug in your computer system, it wreaks havoc on everything else. And sin is like that. And it's the collections of things like sin curves us inward. the enemy is at work in our systems and our structures, and then the wounds we have all faced. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today with some of the wounds that we have faced. But you can go on our podcast and our app and look at that and read that message. It's incredible. So let's talk about today. And here's the major point of today. This is the first slide, is having a life marked by goodness, beauty, and kindness means we must face the inevitable conflict of life and deal with it in pursuit of wholeness. We're not left alone in this. We can follow Jesus and see that he experienced conflict continually through his life. And we believe that practicing the way Jesus handled conflict involves confrontation, healthy speaking, careful listening, and the table. I get to talk about conflict today. And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm an expert on conflict. And it's not because I'm really good at it or I like it. It's actually because I hate it. And my guess is, I was talking with a friend of mine, and I was telling him I'm talking about conflict. And he was like, oh, that's really good for you. And I was like, why? And he was like, because you don't like it. You hate it. But you have to deal with conflict, right? It's this like inevitable things in our life. And I've actually been able to learn a lot of times the hard way about the importance of stepping into conflict. And you can actually bring about a healthy outcome. You can actually bring about peace and wholeness and healing. Because my guess is, if I asked you in this moment to like raise your hand and say, hey, in the past few days, have you had an opportunity or have you had conflict in your life? All of you could probably say, yes, I have had an example of conflict in my life. Because it's not like, hey, will I have it or won't I? It is, when will I? Am I in it? Or when's the next one coming? Or how many kind of conflicting relationships do I have? Sometimes it starts with us. It's on us. Sometimes it starts with somebody else. Sometimes we try our best to like avoid it or go around it. Sometimes we just are like, hey, let's put our head down and attack through it. But it's going to happen. And so I've got some bricks here, right, of what happens when we have conflict. And there's lots and lots of different examples of conflict. Maybe in the room you are married, right? And there's an opportunity for conflict every single day, right? And your spouse comes home and says something to you, and you kind of bite your tongue and don't say anything, but it really, really bothers you what they said, like, hey, why do you leave? I'll be honest with you, my wife. Sometimes I put my clothes in the basket, but not all the way in the basket, like my dirty clothes, right? Like I kind of toss them in. They're in there kind of, but not really. And she'll say something, and maybe it's not the greatest tone, and maybe it kind of hurts my feelings the way she said it. But I don't say anything because I'm really a good person who's going to be like, I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to bite my tongue and preach the patience of Jesus to her. But what's happening is there's walls that are being built up between her and I because of unresolved conflict, even over small things that can build over time, right? Maybe you are in the room and you're a parent. You have kids, right? Maybe you have teenagers. I teach teenagers. They're really tough to deal with. If you're in the room and you're a teenager, I'm going to be honest with you, you're tough to deal with sometimes. We love you, but you are. And you're kind of like, there's these opportunities, it's a door slam, and you're like, I'm not going to deal with that right now. But it is another, in the words of Pink Floyd, a brick in the wall, right, that you're building of conflict, right, that separates us from somebody else. Maybe you have a job, which I'm going to assume the majority of us do, right, and your coworker says something a little offhand, and you're like, ooh, that's really offensive, but again, I can't say anything, or I'm just gonna kind of push it down and push it down. Maybe your boss does something that needs to be taken care of. I'm going to be very forthright with you. I'm in it right now. I have to have a difficult conversation with my boss, and I haven't had the opportunity yet. And it's like hanging over me. But there's this thing that happens even relationally when I like see him in passing. I'm like, oh yeah, that it like carries this weight because I have not dealt with the conflict that I have to deal with. Maybe you live in a neighborhood with an HOA. And you just hate the HOA with all of your heart. Yeah, boo. Thank you. Somebody has, I can tell you HOA experiences for years, right? And there's these walls that we're building up between us and our communities. Maybe in the online space, and I can't go on here anymore, you have a Facebook account, right? And there's somebody like an uncle or an aunt from your past who like makes really offensive comments. And you're like, okay, I'm just going to preach the love of Jesus and not like it or something like that, right? But it builds this like wall between you. So this is the kind of the position that we've put ourselves in because, I must knock that down. right? We have a wall that has separated us from that other person, and it's these examples of conflict. And it's important to define what conflict is. So it can be defined as a serious disagreement regarding a meaningful situation. We're talking about the normal and oftenly emotionally charged disagreements we have with others in our lives. Conflict is not a sign of being unhealthy. Rather, it's unhealthy if you never have conflict. And I've had to like learn that the really hard way. My family story is one that comes from kind of, my mom is very much a peacemaker, and she would love to just kind of have no conflict, so she often just won't say anything. But it's okay. And she often just won't say anything, right? She'll just kind of stuff things down, and she talks about when there's this potential for conflict in the room that she's nauseous, like her stomach is so sick. So I come from this family history that's like, hey, conflict is all bad. And I've had to learn and walk through some really difficult things about learning that, yes, conflict can be uncomfortable. I'm not saying it's not. Conflict can be difficult, but it's also really healthy to work through those things in a great way, and I'm going to hopefully go over that today. When we look at the life of Jesus, though, I just like having examples of people who do stuff well, and I'm going to be honest with you, Jesus is like the perfect example of somebody who does all the stuff really well, but he does conflict amazingly. And if you actually look at his life, if you read through the Bible about Jesus, you can see all of these times when he had opportunities to be in conflict, and he handles them so well. He's not like an avoider, right? He's not unkind or like overly aggressive, but he does speak the truth in love in all of these cases. And so there's multiple cases. I'm not going to read through them all, but I think I have a slide for that. We'll see. Yeah, look at like Satan tempting Jesus, speaking straight with him in truth. When he rebukes the storms and demons, the crowd's expecting the Messiah who frees them from oppression. All of these things happen, right, where people are expecting something of him. They're saying something to him. They're saying offensive things, and he handles it with grace and truth, right? And Jesus has opportunities for conflict time and time again and handles them so well. So I would encourage you, as you read through the scriptures, is to look at that life of Jesus and say, that's a guy who handled conflict perfectly, a model for our own lives. All right, so let's talk about two ways that we deal with conflict that can be a little unhealthy if we're honest with ourselves. And a lot of these things, I'm not getting on to you about them because they come out of actually our past, our trauma, some difficult things we may have experienced, even our family history, like I was talking about. But the first way is we often will avoid conflict, right? So if something comes up, right, and I've dealt with this in my own life at work, right? My boss will say something or do something that I disagree with, right? Or he says something that I really ought to kind of speak up and engage in some healthy conflict around. But I don't, because it's uncomfortable. It's awkward. It's weird. I'm being very honest with you that I don't want to go and do that, because when I do, there's all these weird things at play, like I'm challenging authority, like he could technically fire me, I suppose. And it's just kind of a weird, awkward thing. Like you're telling somebody that you think that they're wrong, that you think that they made a mistake, that they hurt your feelings or things like that. So there's this easy way out. And this is the way that I lean, is towards just absolute avoidance. I don't want to deal with the problem. But the problem is that when you don't deal with something, it still wreaks havoc on you. Like that you can't push something down and not expect it to affect you. And I found this out in my own life as I just kind of avoided conflict. Even in my relationship with my wife, she would say things, and she's, I would tell her this to her face, so I love you, Alicia, who's out with kids. She can be direct, right? And sometimes her directness and like doesn't maybe necessarily come with like the softest approach. It hurts my feelings, right? But I thought to myself, okay, I'm just going to be great, and I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to let it go, because I'm so patient and so kind and so good, right? And I did, but what I found was that I was building a wall between her and I of unhealth. That all of my unresolved conflict had actually put this barrier between us to ultimate wholeness and healing and health. And I was actually resenting her, right? Like she hurt my feelings 2 weeks ago, but she was walking around having no idea that she hurt my feelings 2 weeks ago. But I'm kind of like, I can't believe she would talk to me that way, right? I'm not talking to myself or in the mirror, right? But she's got no idea. And so my avoidance was actually creating a lot of unhealth in me. The other thing that we do sometimes too is, right, we attack. And I'm meaning this in the most unhealthy way as I can, right? Is we say, okay, that person did me wrong, and I'm gonna up the ante, right? I'm gonna take it to the next level. You do me wrong, I will do you twice as wrong. And that is also, on the flip side of that, incredibly unhealthy. But I've got an encouragement to you, right? There is a way forward, and I only know this because I've walked through that way forward myself. One, and this is encouraging, I think. One is you have to do the work. You have to do the work, and I mean that. Like, a great poet once said, like, work, 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 and that was Rihanna. Yeah. If you're Eastown's the only place that I can quote Rihanna and get away with it. Also, if you're new here this morning, this is Eastown. Anyway, so, and I don't mean this in an unhealthy way, right? Like sometimes I think we look at work and we think, oh, I shouldn't have to like earn something or put in effort to something. But you do. I'm going to be honest with you. You do, right? This is not to earn Jesus' love. This is not to earn God's favor with you or love or his gift of salvation. It's none of those things. What it is, though, is it's taking care of yourself with effort and intention. And that sometimes requires sacrifice, but if you put in the work, I promise amazing things can happen. Right? There's a wonderful, I think it was, Oscar-nominated Academy Awards, but Shrek is a great movie, right? And at one point, Shrek is walking through, and he's talking about himself being like an onion, right? And like he's like, if you really want to get to know who I am, you got to pull back the layers of the onion. And he's talking to Eddie Murphy with the donkey there. And I have found this in my life to be so true. I was operating very surface level for a good chunk of my life of saying, okay, I know how to be in certain situations. I'm going to kind of flow and take maybe the path of least resistance. But what I found out is when I do the work and pull back the layers of myself, God has something amazing to teach me in that process. And so a few years ago, I think it's been about 3.5 now, my wife and I, like I said, we had actually been both doing this to each other. And so we had a barrier between us that wasn't as bright or colorful as this thing. And we said, okay, like we need help. Like we can't just kind of operate in this. We've got kids. We want to be whole and healthy. We'd like to have a thriving marriage. And so we said, okay, let's put some work in. So we actually went and got counseling. Now, the culture I grew up in around counseling was one that you only got counseling if you were like in emergency crisis. And so when I told my parents that we were in counseling, they immediately were like, are you guys through? Are you guys done? What's going on? And it's been cool to walk through this journey of saying, no, like counseling is actually the most helpful thing that we have done. And while we weren't in necessarily like on the edge of the cliff crisis, I can tell you that counseling has saved my marriage, has saved I would say my life in a lot of ways. And my counselor's name is Dave. And I love Dave. Dave is like an older, white kind of haired Buddha. And he's just a genius, right? And he loves Jesus. And he's constantly pointing me towards health, towards wholeness, towards peace, right? And I'm gonna give you a little like armchair psychology just for a second. Please don't come up to me afterwards and be like, you missed like in 1972. I don't want to know that. I do, but I'm gonna give you a little armchair psychology. So there's this theory out there that it's called IFS, and if you've seen the movie Inside Out, it's that idea that there are parts of us internally, and those parts are actually like a good thing, right? And a lot of them are defined by our experiences or our childhood, and those parts they're designed really to protect us. And so I'll give you an example. I grew up in a very conservative, strict culture, very religious culture. And there's a part of me that did not like the feeling of oppression, that didn't like the feeling of like rigidity. And so even now today, I lean towards more rebellion, more like anti-authority, some of those issues. But I didn't know that about myself until I started counseling, for example. So I was just rebellious as a teenager and a young adult. I was constantly pushing the envelope, like constantly pushing against kind of what people told me to do. And I didn't understand that about myself until I did the work in counseling. And now that part of me, which wants to protect me from kind of like some of those rigidities that I grew up in, is saying, hey, rebel, don't do those things. And I can actually provide leadership to those things. I can actually talk about that in some really good ways. I have another part, and the other part of me is very anti-conflict, because my mom taught me conflict is bad through her actions, not necessarily her words, but all through her actions, through our avoidance of conflict growing up, through all of the things that I did as a kid, that teenagers that I needed to be dealt with, my mom avoided, right? And I love you, Mom. If you're online, please don't be. She loved me, and she was loving me as best as she could, right? But conflict was a difficult thing for her. Now, on the flip side, conflict for my dad was a very easy thing, but not in the healthiest way. And so I had two of the kind of flip sides of conflict in my life. So I walked out of that saying, I don't know how to deal with any of this stuff. And it was actually only through Dave and learning more about myself, about how God created me, and about how my childhood and my experiences have shaped me over time, about peeling back the onion layers and doing the work to actually understand what kind of makes me tick and what motivates me. And so my encouragement to you is, when it comes to conflict, is to try to understand a little bit more about who you are. If you have a shame thing about counseling, I want you to know it's not from Jesus, right? We cannot do this life alone. Again, my marriage, I think is alive and thriving today because of ultimately Dave. Dave is not watching, but if you were, Dave, I love you. The second thing I would tell you, outside of just putting the work in, is this idea of contemplative prayer. And this contemplative prayer is practice of simply offering ourselves to God through silence, scripture, and self-examination to reveal in us the ways we might be adding to the fractures in our world instead of displaying the love Jesus intended. I need to take a moment sometimes to almost like bring it down and erase all the distractions and be silent and sit with Jesus and ask him, show me where I'm kind of being a part of the fractures, or I'm being a part of the conflict, because sometimes I don't see it in myself. And I think there's something cool that happens when you do this, where Jesus will often show you. Like, something will come to your mind that's not from you, and I'm going to bet you that's probably from Jesus pointing out something, where he brings up a relationship or an unresolved conflict or anything like that. And so let's check out this quote from the book from Rich Viotis. Our world is fractured, not because there's no state-approved affirmation of Christian prayer, but because many followers of Christ have not learned to pray in a way that opens us up to God's healing. We want to continue to look at what God wants to form in us so that we can bring about goodness and beauty and kindness in this world. We have to sit before God, right, and allow him to show us and form us and shape us into who he wants to be. And maybe that's uncomfortable for you in the room, and I get that, right? If you've not practiced prayer in your life, or contemplative prayer, right, just sit and just ask God to show you something, it can be a little weird and a little uncomfortable. If you have distraction issues like I do, and you all of a sudden erase like a phone and kids screaming and things like that, and it's just quiet, like by 30 seconds in, I've thought about 18 different things and my distraction's over. I'm going to tell you though, it's like sports, it's like music. If you put the practice in, if you put the time in, you can get to 45 seconds. You can get to a minute maybe. And there's no shame in any of that stuff, right? Just put in the time and put in the practice. So let's look at how we do this well. Let's maybe you're thinking of a relationship in your life that has this barrier, right? And how can we break it down? How can we actually bring about some healthy conflict in our lives? Look at this verse from Hebrews 12:14. It goes like this: work at living in peace with everyone and work at living a holy life. For those who are not holy will not see the Lord. And I love this verse because it talks about, I actually think when you work these steps out of healthy conflict, you can see God at work in that. I have had that opportunity so many times, where even in work situations where I've had to have some courage and I've had to step up and say something. And that's kind of been my word when it comes to conflict, is this idea of courage. The outcome has been way better than I expected. Because I'll be honest with you, like I negative role play it. I'm like, okay, here's what he's going to say. I'm going to be like sitting there silent, and it's not going to go well, and he's going to fire me, and I'm going to be walking out with like a sad song playing with all of my stuff in a cardboard box, and it's going to be bad. But every single time it always goes better. I'm like, oh, God, you did something in there that was not me. Like you used me in healthy conflict, and I think that can happen. All right, so let's talk about healthy conflict. I'm going to knock down this wall, and no, I'm not going to knock it down. I'm just going to do that. And so when we talk about healthy conflict, there are 4 steps that I think we can go from having a barrier between us to having a bridge between us instead. So I'm going to build a bridge, and it's going to go really well, is what I'm going to tell you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Let's speak that in existence. All right, the first one that healthy conflict requires is this idea of confrontation, right? And confrontation, you actually have to take the step towards it. Confrontation is really, really important. If you don't do that, and confrontation, by the way, actually means like to turn towards. Actually to step and face towards the problem, to not avoid it or turn away and act like it's not there. And if you look at this verse in Matthew 18, this is kind of a classic one, right? It goes, if a fellow believer hurts you, go and tell him. Work it out between the 2 of you. If he listens, you've made a friend. If he won't listen, take 1 or 2 others along, so that the presence of witnesses will keep things honest, and try again. I think this is such a good thing. We're working on this with my kids right now, who are 8 and 6, and then our foster son is 4. So life is crazy. Where they'll come and they'll often tattle on each other. Like, so-and-so hit me, or so-and-so did this, and they took my toy, and they did this, and they did that, right? And what we're trying to do is put into practice where we say, have you talked to them? Like, have you gone back and said, that hurt my feelings? I remember early on in Eastown, Clint said this all the time, and I remember thinking, that's just really good, right? And so 1 out of like 20 is a great rate for good things that Clint says. I'm just kidding this group. And he said, like, hey, if you have a problem with somebody, don't talk to me about it. And he would, and it's such a funny thing, you're right? No, I'm supposed to bring my pastor all my problems, right? And so what you do is you go to that other person, you say, or I go to Clint and I say, can you believe so-and-so? Right? Can you believe what they've done? And what I'm doing is I'm actually just gossiping and actually ruining their reputation to him. And what I love about what he used to say, and still does, is go to the person. Deal with that stuff. I have a student team, like a community service team of 20 kids, and we're about to leave on Thursday for 10 days together. It's like a camping experience where they're doing community service every day. It's going to be wild. 20 juniors and seniors. Pray for me. And we're dealing with this right now too. I'm like, if there is a fracture in the room, if there is conflict, unhealthy, unresolved conflict between you guys, there are going to be major issues on this trip when you're in close proximity, right? That's not going to end well unless you deal with it, unless you actually confront each other. And they're like, what? I don't want to do that, right? Because that's the voice that it goes on in our head as we say, oh, I'm not good at that. I'm not good at conflict. I'm bad at it, right? So we kind of psych ourselves out with that voice in our head. And we think to ourselves, obviously there's a lot of different cultures in the room and in the Bay, and we think to ourselves, well, some cultures, it's very offensive to go and talk directly in that way, so I'm not going to do that. And what I would tell you is that that's often the voice of shame, right? Kurt Thompson, in his book, The Soul of Shame, says this: I do not have what it takes to tolerate this moment. And that is the voice of shame, and it's a lie. It's wrong. You do have what it takes. I've literally had to tell myself, not hit myself in the face or anything, but like tell myself in the mirror and like psych myself up and say, I have what it takes to face this moment. There is something that's very, like this, I told you before, this idea of courage, right? It says it all the way throughout the Bible. And I've really had to kind of latch on to that idea of taking courage in the moment. And I have this permanently etched on me. And it's this lion, and on it, it says, take courage. And it's this idea that I can be bold like that in those moments. I can have courage to actually step in and confront. I do have what it takes. Not in a prideful way, but with Jesus' help in my life, I can actually step into confrontation, and it's not going to end as poorly as maybe I perceive it to be. All right, so that's the first one, confrontation. The second one is this idea of healthy speaking. Healthy speaking. These are going to stick together perfectly. Oh, look at that. Of healthy speaking. So check out this verse. This is from Proverbs 18:21. Words kill, words give life. They're either poison or fruit. You choose. The way we talk to each other, right? Sometimes we want to attack and we want to get the advantage over the other person. But there's some words that can kill, right? And I'm going to give you some examples of those. One is when we attack the character of the other person. If I have a problem with my wife and I say, this is who you are, you've always been unkind, that's who you are in your character, my words are actually killing her at a soul level, about a character level, about who she is. Another way that we use words that kill is to bring up the past, right? Well, this happened 6 years ago. And let me bring that up and use it against you, right? If it's done and dealt with in a healthy way, you have to leave it in the past, right? Avoid using always, never, or every time styled statements. Those are only problematic. In your relationships, in your friendships, in your work colleague relationships, if you use the language, you always do this, you never do this, those are never helpful. They always take the conversation straight down. And then I would teach you to avoid interrupting. Nothing devalues another person like interrupting them when they're halfway through. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second here. Some fruitful speaking, words that give life, is when you attack the problem, not the person. Right? If I have conflict with somebody and I go after who they are, I'm actually placing so little value on them. And it's not the heart of the problem. We have to stay focused on the issue between us. I would encourage you to lead with grace. Lead with language like I feel or my perception is. This seems like. So in the case of me never throwing my laundry away, if my wife says, you don't care about us in this house, or you don't care about me, you always do this, immediately my defensive walls go up, right? But there's an opportunity, I think, for her to say, and me to say, hey, I feel like you're not doing this intentionally. My perception is, and it hurts my feelings, that you're not taking the time to do this. And when you use your tone in a softer manner, you can actually de-escalate a situation. I used to work at a school for students who had some pretty severe trauma in their life, and they taught you how to de-escalate a situation when things were up. And one of the ways is your tone. Your tone absolutely matters. If you speak with a soft, kind of easy tone, you can bring down a situation. One of my favorite speakers, podcasters, authors is Brene Brown, and she uses the language, clarity is kindness, right? If you can speak clearly about the issue, you're actually doing the other person the greatest kindness by just being forthright and just being honest, rather than kind of like working your way around, I kind of think this, I kind of think that. In Proverbs 15:1, it says this, a gentle response diffuses anger, but a sharp tongue kindles a temper fire. Show the value of each other, this idea of imago Dei, that we're made in the image of God. The way I talk, the way I treat somebody else determines often how they feel or how they see themselves. We have an opportunity to place the highest value on them. The person across the street, your spouse, your neighbor, your friend, your coworker, are all made in the image of God. They are God's valuable creation, their son or daughter. And the way we talk to them, the way we view them, right, says actually a little bit more about us. Actually, Carl Jung said this, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That's so brilliant, right? Like, the things that are bothering me about somebody else or a situation are often point more towards my issues than they do theirs. Not always, but sometimes. And then Martin Luther King Jr. said this, man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. Do you love the other person. And often, I know that they're hard to love. There are situations where people can be really, really difficult to love. But when you approach these things with that first, there's an opportunity for reaching a healthy outcome in healthy conflict. All right, let's look at number 3. Number 3 is careful listening. Careful listening. Look at that stick perfectly. And careful listening is so important. In fact, I feel like it's one of the most important. Harper Lee, in her book To Kill a Mockingbird, says this: you never really understand a person until you consider things from his or her point of view. That's so brilliant. If you hadn't read that book, you really ought to. I would encourage you, when you enter into these opportunities for conflict and try to see them as opportunities, is to listen first, right? One way you can do that is you can ask questions. Dave, my brilliant counselor, love you, Dave, said this. He talked to us about this idea called the comfort circle. If you ever heard of this, it's brilliant. It's also awkward and painful, so I'm going to tell you about that too. And the comfort circle is this idea of if Clint and I have a problem, and I've confronted him and said, hey, when you do this, it makes me feel this. I just need to bring it to you, or else it's going to, sit on my heart for a long time, and I don't want to be bitter or angry. So can we talk about this? What I have to then do is I have to give him the opportunity to talk it out and to tell me. And the rule of the comfort circle that Dave has taught us, and he made us actually like role play it in our counseling, and it was so painful because I was like, I got things to say. But my wife had to tell me. So Clint would just tell me, well, this and this and this and this and this. And I go, okay, thank you. And I can't respond, only to ask questions like, is there anything else? And you just have to ask questions like that and keep it open-ended. And you're also allowed to repeat what he said. So if he says, well, I did it because you're really bothering me with your behavior. I say, so I'm bothering you with my behavior. I can only do that. I cannot defend myself. I cannot go on the attack. I can't go after. And I'm telling you, it is amazing. It's also really hard to do. At the end of it, what I have to say to Clint is, what do you need from me? And that's a hard thing to do sometimes. But then what happens next is, I don't want to say like I get my turn, because that's not the idea of it. But then the other person gets the opportunity to share what they are feeling, what they are going through. And the other person has to only sit and respond with questions or say, okay, this is what you said. And it's so fascinating because sometimes in my anger or in my frustration, I will say things that I don't always mean. Have you ever been in this position, right? You'll say things out of the heat of the moment in anger. And what's really interesting is I've done that in front of Dave in the comfort circle with Alicia. I say something that's like not the kindest. And she repeats it back to me. And I go, oh, that's not really what I meant. Sorry, can I take that back? And it's this really great opportunity to just kind of have this moment where you take care of each other and you give each other the opportunity to be heard. There is so much value in being heard without being interrupted, being listened to. Check out this verse from James 1:19. Post this at all the intersections, dear friends. Lead with your ears, follow up with your tongue, and let anger straggle along in the rear. God's righteousness doesn't grow from human anger. I think when we just kind of go back and forth, when we volley back and forth each other in these arguments, in these conflicts, it is going to end poorly. But when we say, let me listen to you, let me respond with grace and kindness and forget about the anger that it happens, right? The defensiveness, right? And you can even say, hey, I'm feeling a little defensive in this moment. All of these things, by the way, have taken me a ton of practice, and I'm still really terrible at them, just to be forthright with you. But the practice is where it's at, right? When you do these things in conflict, you can get better at it. I was your poster boy for anti-conflict. And now I've learned in the opportunities where I've had to engage in it in a healthy way, it has been incredible. Let's look at the fourth and final piece of this. And the table is the fourth one. Oh, it worked. Good. When you put all four of those together, You create a bridge, right, between the two rather than that barrier. You might be like, okay, what does a table mean? I think there's two things about the table, right? One is that you have to bring somebody who you're struggling with, right, around the table. Something amazing happens around a table, inviting somebody in, sitting them at dinner. But the real focus I want to make today on the table is this idea of communion. And we're going to practice communion here this morning. And communion is an incredible thing, an awesome, awesome reminder. But out of our own power, we cannot do this well. When you try to do things like, hey, I've got this on my own, I can do things in my own power, I'll be honest with you, the bridge will fail. You've got to have the most important piece, and that is the power of Jesus in us. Asking the Holy Spirit to guide, to calm, to bring peace, right? Communion is actually a reminder that Jesus poured his love out for us through the breaking of his body and the shedding of his blood. It was for me. Jesus died for me. Jesus died for you. Jesus died for your unkind neighbor. Jesus died for the coworker. Jesus died for my boss. Jesus died for the people that I struggle with the most and the people that I love the most. And communion takes that moment to remind us that he did that for every single one of us. And because of that sacrifice, we're actually empowered to love and heal and move towards wholeness in him. I want to get something really, really clear. Like, this series is amazing, right? And we're giving you some practices, right? How to handle healthy conflict. This isn't like a life hack or some kind of like how-to manual, right? Like, hey, habits and the power of habits, those are all good things. Don't get me wrong, right? But the point of it is that to understand that God loves us so much that he sent his son to die for us, who rose again, and has a dream of a good and a beautiful and a kind life for us in him. And there's opportunities to do conflict and to do life differently through his power. When we pursue Jesus, we have this opportunity for wholeness in our relationships because God is the ultimate, perfect, good, and beautiful and kind God and wants to have that relationship with us and for then us to carry those values, to carry those ideas out to others, even when it's difficult. Even when it's difficult. I'm going to pray, and the band's going to come up, and after I pray, we're gonna take communion together, and I'll kind of guide you through that. We're going to do it a little bit differently than we've normally done it here at Eastown. But let me pray. God, we love you. We're thankful for the opportunity, God, that you give us to engage in healthy conflict. Thank you for the opportunity to be in relationship with others. And God, we know because of sin, of the fractures, of the enemy, of the selfishness and the sin that curves us inward, God, conflicts can get messy. Relationships can get difficult. God, I pray that in all areas of our life, in all relationships, we take the opportunity to build a bridge, God, rather than a barrier between us, God. And maybe there's a moment in the room or somebody in the room who's thinking of a relationship that's difficult, that's challenging, that's broken. God, I pray for healing there. I pray for the opportunity to confront with healthy speaking, with kind words that give life, and the opportunity to just listen and show value to each other. God, we love you. We're thankful for you. In your name, amen.